These films in Yugoslavia were very special not only because of their innovative forms, but primarily because of their social and political message. Those were the films which stood up against the prevailing ideology of the time and were all of a sudden about an individual, because before that in Yugoslavia, films in the late 40s and 50s had to be centered on the collective, and these were the first films which took an individual and his problems and needs as a center of their attention. Another specific of these films were that they were political in the sense that the young filmmakers who made them were actually all young idealistic Marxists who didn't like the way where Yugoslavia was going at that time. They realized that the old partisans who fought the Second World War and now assumed all the power structures are becoming something that they call the red bourgeoisie, that they're more or less turning into an upper structure, and they were afraid that Yugoslavia is only saying that it's a socialistic country, blah blah blah, but in reality it's becoming some sort of a strange semi-capitalistic totalitarian regime, so they were making these films to somehow try to return Yugoslavia on its rightful way towards the path to communism through socialism, and also to expose certain social injustices which officially did not exist. For example, when Želimir Žilnik made this film in '72, the idea of a homeless person did not exist in Yugoslavia. If you would talk to officials or policemen, Yugoslavia had no homeless people. So he made a film about the homeless people to show that they exist, and you saw that the way the people in the film reacted to it, a lot of the ordinary people were actually really surprised. What is a homeless person? Can't he go to a hotel? And they were really honest in this, they were not making a joke. So in a way, these people here were behaving like Marie Antoinette, who when confronted the hungry people said, well, they have no bread, they should eat cake. But it was called black film because very soon critics started criticizing these films by saying that they're all black and that they're portraying a certain black reality which does not exist, and that they're distorting the beautiful illusion of Yugoslavian socialism, and they called them black wave as some sort of a derogative label. So to make fun of that, Želimir Žilnik called his film black film. Strangely, or not strangely at all, the film was not banned, as many people think today that these films in Yugoslavia were all banned. None of them were banned. Okay, one was banned, but only because the filmmaker really wanted his film to be banned. They were made, they were shown, they were discussed, they went abroad, they won awards. So the freedom of speech was on a high level. So much about the context. Now, if we look at this film as, let's say, an ordinary, simple example of a documentary film, we immediately notice some very, very interesting stylistic characteristics. For example, one of them, perhaps the most important one, is that the film looks raw. It looks like a very crude film. You know, the camera is all the time shaking, it's not steady, the cinematography is not always in focus. And above all, it doesn't look like it had a script before it was made. It looks like a film which was made for little or no money. In reality, the budget for this film was zero. Or, to be very precise, the budget of this film was the cost of one single reel of 16mm film. It was shot. The way the film was shot was, the director of photography of this film was Karpo Godina, who is a rather famous Slovenian filmmaker and also served as the director of photography for the films of Želimir Žilnik. And one night they were drinking beer and Karpo Godina had a camera next to him, and Želimir Žilnik said, let's make a film about homeless people. And they just simply set off into the night, and everything that happened completely spontaneously, without a script, without any money, just with a simple camera. 16mm camera in those days was like a cheap, smaller camera. The norm before video was invented was 35mm. 16mm was considered for amateurs or for use in television. So the film stock was very cheap, cameras were cheap. So they basically made this film on the spot. They improvised the film. And as such, I mean, I don't know if you will agree that the film is important and that it has a message which is still important today, but as such, this film is a wonderful example how, in order to make a film which will be good, which will be successful, which will address important issues in a way that will make people think about them, you don't really need a tripod, you don't really need a script, a scenographer, or all these things that people teach you in film schools. that filmmaking is a very serious thing. All you need, like in this case, is a good heart, which is obviously something that Jean has, and a good idea, and a very simple, knowledge and simple means through which you execute this idea. Because one unfortunate problem with cinema, which has existed throughout the history of cinema, is that cinema is being presented as this really special thing, and we all have to go through 4 years of film school in order to learn, and then we all have to learn how to properly frame and properly edit. And it's all actually bullshit, because a good artist is not necessarily, or not at all, the one who is able to draw good. It's the one who is able to think good. And if you're able to think good and you have ideas, then you can make good films, like you make a good painting, or write a good novel, or whatever. So, as such, this film, it teaches us that, script is something which is not necessary. In all the film schools, they will tell you, even for documentary films, you first need to have a script, and only with the script, then you're able to shoot a film. But the very idea of a script is completely alien to cinema. I mean, cinema has existed for 10, 20 years without the idea of script being invented. The idea of script came much later. It came much later because if a producer had a script, he was able to evaluate how much the movie would cost, and then they would make a film. So this idea of script that comes before making a film is something which is connected exclusively to this economic aspect of filmmaking. And I do believe that we are not here interested in making films in order to make money, but in making films and showing films and teaching people how to show films, which, like I said before, address important issues, and not exclusively to make money. I mean, if they make money with that, then okay, nothing wrong with that. Some sort of a social worker, so he was aware of all these problems which the official ideology did not admit that they exist, and he made a series of films, not only on homeless people in that period, he made a series of films on various problems which officially did not exist. This actually means that a filmmaker is very smart because he realizes that the fundamental characteristic of a film medium is something which is, by definition, per se unpredictable. It's the external world, the reality. Let's for a second assume that such a thing like external reality, which exists beyond us, exists. And if we take a look at the history of cinema from that perspective, we notice something very unusual. The entire history of cinema seems to be a history of bending and twisting this reality according to our vision. And this is, of course, impossible to attain, because it is the very nature of reality that it is unpredictable. We cannot predict what will happen in any given moment. But the whole history of film, the reason why they started making films in the studios, why they started imitating exterior within interior, was to somehow force reality to completely conform itself to our vision. And that's actually quite a horrible thing, because that means that we are depriving cinema from all the richness and the beauty that we can get from cinema if we simply let this outside reality behave as it does in fiction, but especially in documentary films. There are a lot of filmmakers, or I will say that all the really great filmmakers have at some point realized that it's a complete nonsense to try to fight this reality and repeat takes for 1,000 times. Okay, it can function if you're somebody like Kubrick, who has this crazy, precise vision and millions of dollars to execute it. But normally all the great films are films which realized that they should just simply, embrace this fact that reality is completely unpredictable, that anything can happen, and that's it. Like I said, most documentaries are like that. For example, quite possibly the most important documentary filmmaker ever, who is luckily still alive, Frederick Wiseman, you probably heard of him. We actually did a retrospective of his films in Kinoteca this March, and he's over 80 years old, he made some 50 films, and when he makes his documentary films, he doesn't dare to envision anything. When he's making a documentary film, he simply selects a place where he will shoot. So all his films have titles which are simply names of places. He has films called Hospital, High School, Central Park, Police Station. And then he goes to that place and he does nothing. He just sits there, I mean, he moves around, and he shoots. And he observes. And he shoots hours and hours and hours of material. He's the one who not really invented, but perfected this very particular form of documentary filmmaking, which is called fly on the wall, which means that the filmmaker does not interfere in any way with what he's shooting. Because in this film, Željko was in the film personally, and he was interviewing people. And then he let them speak for themselves. But what Frederick Wiseman is doing, he's just invisible. He's just there and he's shooting, and then he shapes all this raw material which he has amassed in these places into a film. And believe it or not, those films, when you watch them, they seem like hyper-suspenseful thrillers. We just watch ordinary people talk to each other, interact with each other, do their regular job, but those are actually amazing films. And all he did was, he was patient, and he had a good eye. So yeah, he realizes that what is there already is enough. Because filmmaking is not like writing a book. When you're writing a book, you have a blank page, and you can do whatever you want with this blank page. I mean, you actually have to shape your words and sentences into exactly what you want them to be, if you want the book to be good. If you paint, it's the same. I mean, you're dealing with a blank canvas and a pen, but when you're filming, this around you is unpredictable, unlike words and black canvas, white canvas. And Željko is one of the filmmakers who is totally aware of this. I mean, when he started shooting this film, he had no idea how the film would develop. Maybe on the next day he would find a good soul who would say, okay, I have a house, and in my house I have a room, and you can put all these people in my room. Or he would find somebody who would say, let's give these people a job. He didn't. The film ends on a somewhat sad note. He's forced to put all these people away from his house, but you know, he was just not pretending that he knows anything. He just, you know, let reality be reality, and he was there as a filmmaker to record it. And of course to intervene, but we'll come to that subject later. And this also applies to fiction filmmakers. We have all probably seen films about making films, when you see a filmmaker who is directing actors and who's saying, again, it was not good, do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. And usually, I mean, this is like a very regular occurrence in Slovenian films, which is one of the reasons why the films appear so stilted when we watch them. But the best, for example, some of the best fiction films, for example, I don't know, you probably know John Cassavetes, a very famous American, probably the most famous American independent filmmaker. He also never had a script when he was shooting his fiction films. He was lucky to have a pool of great actors who would work more or less for free for him. He had ideas about what their characters are. He invented situations, and then he just let them be. And they did some films which are, in terms of acting, quite possibly films with the best acting in the entire history of cinema. One such example, for example, a contemporary one that you might know better would be somebody like, I don't know, Lars von Trier, who is doing the same. I mean, he has actors and he just lets them be, and they run around and he's shooting, and he's simply allowing reality to leave its imprint onto his films, which, like I said before, is especially important for documentary films. Because documentary films are supposed to tell the truth and are supposed to, present us the reality the way it is. American-French theoretician by the name of Noel Birch, who wrote a fantastic book called Theory of Film Practice. And the book delivers exactly what's in the title, Theory of Film Practice. So it's really one of the greatest books on the theory of film practice. So I warmly recommend it. It's only out in English and French, if somebody speaks French. The second or the third very important thing that this small film shows us is hidden in the figure of the director, Željko in the film. When Željko did that, when he put himself in the film in '71, this was not a usual practice. This inserting yourself in the film, not the news, is something that became really popular in cinema only, let's say, in the last decade, when somebody like Michael Moore, who is supposed to reinvent documentary films and bring them to the multiplexes, kept on putting himself in the film. But what Jeremy Jelinek is trying to do by putting himself in the film is he's trying to warn us or remind us that even though we think that documentary films are, supposed to be reality, unfiltered, up on screen, that's not true at all. I mean, the very idea of a documentary film as a document of something, of truth, of reality, is idiotic, because every film is necessarily a completely subjective record of something. And no matter how hard a filmmaker tries to exclude himself outside of the material and to make an objective film, he will never succeed. He will, by trying hard to do that, he will just fail more miserably. To give you some examples of what I just said. Usually when people think about film history, they say, okay, film history began with, on one hand, the Lumière brothers, and on the other hand, Georges Méliès. And they say Lumière is the inventor of documentary cinema because he was recording reality, and Georges Méliès is the inventor of fiction because he was creating these fictitious rooms and props and telling these stories. But when film historians and normal historians were carefully studying the very first film that the Lumière brothers made, the arrival of the train up to the train station, La Ciotat, you've seen it probably, right, that famous short film, they realized that the people who are walking off the train are not just some random passengers. There was the wife of Lumière and his grandmother and his children and his best friends. So the very first shot in the film, in the history of cinema, was staged. Lumière simply loaded those films in the train one station before. He very carefully set the frame. He told the conductor to bring the train forward. People stepped out. He knew exactly when they would step out so he could adjust the focus and the light. So it was a completely constructed little film which presented itself as a documentary. I mean, at that time, the idea of documentary didn't exist. It is the film history who went back and said, this is the beginning of documentary. I'm not saying that we should, from now on, consider all films in the film history as fiction. I'm just saying that, no documentary can ever avoid being subjective and being constructed, even completely constructed. For example, the first really famous documentary filmmaker, Robert Flaherty, I'm sure that you already either heard of him or will hear of him in your courses on film history. He made a really famous silent documentary called Nanook of the North, which is depicting the life of a certain Native American Eskimo. And it's a film that shows simple scenes in the life of this Eskimo, how he's fishing, how he's building his igloo, and it all seems like, it's a documentary film. But in reality, for example, the cameras that Flaherty had were too big, so he couldn't shoot the interior of an igloo, so they built a bigger igloo and they spliced it in half and they faked the interior of the igloo. So basically the whole film is staged and recreated, and the thing which still makes it a documentary, of course, is the fact that Nanook, the title character, actually plays himself in the film, which then presents itself as documentary and not fiction. Or I mentioned before Frederick Wiseman, who is just spending days, weeks, months in a certain institution or a certain area and recording, and people are not observing him, and one would think, okay, he really achieved that stage in which the filmmaker is completely not present in the film. He completely removed himself. What we see is really objective reality. Again, this is not true, because he at one point turned on the camera and at one point turned it off. He decided what to record and what not to record. And we will never know what he skipped out. We only see what he decided to show us. And then when he was editing, he decided to put something first and something last. So if you speak to him, for example, he will openly admit that his films are not documentary films, and that he sees himself not as an observer in the sense I would be, I don't know, or he would be observing people if you sit on a train station and look at people on the other side of the street. He sees himself more as a Balzac, for example, a writer who would, observe reality and then write it down. The idea of them actually entering the film with your own voice, at least, became very present in documentary cinema in the late 50s, or even early 50s and 60s, with the emergence of a very important documentary film movement called the New British Cinema, and also during the aforementioned French Nouvelle Vague with filmmakers like Chris Marker, who were making these video essays and put their own voice and their own thinking in the film. And Jeremy Žilnik put personally himself in the film, as we have just seen, therefore telling us that what we're seeing is some sort of an interpretation of this problem and not this problem as such presented to us, you know, without any filters. But we cannot blame him for that, because he's just aware of the fact that documentary films, like fiction films, are constructions and not reality itself. The official political reaction to this film was very, very interesting. And this is something which I wanted to speak about in the latest point that we can learn from this film. Okay. Since we actually see homeless people in this film, the official politics could not say that homeless people don't exist anymore. It's very important to know that when this film was made, I mean, today we live in a different world. If somebody would make a brilliant documentary today about a problem which is important today, just like the homeless people were problematic in '72, there's a very high chance that nobody will notice your film. You can put it on YouTube, you can show it at 500 festivals, but it will completely not affect politics, this is because today we are completely saturated with audiovisual images everywhere. So cinema has, I'm afraid to say, almost completely lost this incredible social power which it had in '72. When these people, like Jeremy Žilnik and his peers, were making films in the '70s, every single film they made a splash. It was a big thing, not only in the circles of film criticism, it was discussed in the circles of politics. It was a big event. So when this film came out, all of a sudden they could not hide the fact, like I said, that homeless people do exist, because if they would, what Jeremy Žilnik would do, he would probably find these people in the street again and bring them personally with him to Belgrade and tell them, look, here they are. What they did say was they accused Jeremy Žilnik of fake humanism. They were saying, not only is this film bad because it portrays Yugoslavia in a bad light, and people from Germany and everywhere where this film is shown can now see that the situation in Yugoslavia is horrible with all these homeless people. They said Jeremy Žilnik is a bad filmmaker. First of all, he cannot frame a shot. He cannot put a camera on a Steadicam. He made a film which has no structure. He made a film with a very poor sound. He made a film where throughout the film we can hear the camera rolling. They say he's a very untalented filmmaker. But this is all bullshit. I mean, these are all technical details. It's like saying Picasso is a bad painter because he cannot, he cannot write a face, draw a face that really recognizes the face. The third thing which they accused him of, that's very interesting, they accused him of fake humanism. They accused him of only pretending that he cares for these people, whereas in reality he doesn't care for them, and he shows that by throwing them out of his apartment and by exploiting them to become famous. And this critique became very, very popular, and it was actually, it stuck with Jeremy Žilnik for a very long time. But this critique misses a certain very, very important point that this film makes, because we see a lot of documentary films today being made where a filmmaker would sit at home and scratch his head or her head and say, what is a hot subject today? Let's see. Immigrants, homeless people, organ trades, prostitution, let's make a film about that. And then they go and they make a film about that, and the film becomes famous, and they become famous, and they forget about the issue and move on. Jeremy Žilnik doesn't do that. Jeremy Žilnik, it's a human characteristic that he has, but every time he makes a film, for him making the film is not only making a film, for him making the film is only part of a social process that he is involved with the people, which is another very, very important thing for a documentary filmmaker. When you're making a documentary film, you should not be making a film about the people, you should be making a film with the people, because only then can you properly assume responsibilities that you have. As soon as I hear a documentary filmmaker talking how he made a film about something, I get sick a little bit, because this idea of I'm making a film about that immediately implies that there's a line. Here is me, a bourgeois, white filmmaker with a camera, and I'm making a film about these people. And when I'm done, I'm going to move forward. Žilnik actually is making films with all the people he makes films with. I mean, this is not evident from the film, this is like now peripheral information, but he has in his career made films with all kinds of groups which otherwise do not have access themselves to the medium of cinema. So, for example, he made films with the Roma people who were expelled from Germany as refugees and were returned to ex-Yugoslavia and couldn't find their way there. He made films with, with really various groups which are in one way or another despised, socially endangered, and he always stays with the people. For example, he made this famous trilogy called the Kennedy trilogy, which involves a very good friend of him, Kennedy Hassani, and they are excellent friends. I mean, he's good friends with all the people who are in his films, and he would often come back to them and make films with them again and help them in that way. But by doing what he does in this film, by actually, taking them into his apartment and then putting them out, he is questioning this position of a filmmaker and what, if anything at all, films can change. And he's actually questioning this idea of humanism, which is supposed to exist in documentary films. I mean, every second documentary film which is made today is made on a social problem. And they all present themselves as, we are these humanistic filmmakers making films about these tragic subjects. And Jeremy Žilnik is actually attacking fake humanism with this film. He's saying, I mean, what can I do? I can take you to my apartment, but I cannot live like that because my room is too small. My paycheck is too small. My wife will eventually get angry with me and throw you out. He only had one reel of 16mm film running for 15 minutes. So when the film ends, that little small ending when the film ends and it runs in black and we can only hear the music, that's actually like a small signal, the film has ended. We ran out of film. He even says it in the film. There's nothing, really nothing more that I can do at the moment. I can make this film and I can show it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm here to solve your problems. I cannot do that. Maybe people will see the film, they will become aware. And here he succeeded. But this question of is he a humanist or a fake humanist is actually, funnily enough, even completely irrelevant, because even if he would be a fake humanist and he would make this film with nothing but pretension to become famous, which is not true, then the film would still have an effect. It's not really important if deep down inside you are a humanist or a non-humanist. Okay. So this was the official reaction. You're a fake humanist. I mean, this is one. Okay, we're straying a little bit away from our subject, documentary cinema, but we're still inside the 20th century and the history of cinema. Like I said before, in Yugoslavia, films were not banned. Only one film was banned. It's called Plastic Jesus. It's a completely different story. So when people like Jeremy Žilnik were making these films were shown because in Yugoslavia there were really a lot of film festivals dedicated to short films, to documentary films, to experimental films. So these films were shown on festivals, they were shown on television, and there were some festivals abroad which realized that something very special is happening in Yugoslavia, so they would invite these films abroad. Jeremy Žilnik, for example, in '72, when he made this film, he already had in his pocket a Golden Bear, which he won for his first feature-length film, Rani Radovi, Early Works. So he was already a major figure on the international film scene. And his films were seen. They were not banned, and this is something which is very funny. Of course, they did not enter distribution. They were not shown in regular cinemas. But this is completely the same as today. If today you go to a regular cinema, to a multiplex, or even to an art house cinema, you don't see short films playing in distribution. You see them if they're screened at special events. And there's an interesting anecdote connected to this. A lot of filmmakers from that era, not Jeremy Žilnik, but a lot of other filmmakers, when they look back, they say our films were banned because they were not shown anywhere. And this has become like the prevailing doctrine. And this is stupid. This is like saying that a filmmaker who makes an art house film, which is not shown anywhere, maybe one screening in Kinoteka, one in Kinodvor in Ljubljana, and then the filmmaker will say, my film is banned because they're not shown in Colosseum. It's nonsense. Even in Yugoslavia, cinemas were making money, and the regular theater owner would look at this and would say, this is crap. Who wants to see this? Of course, I will not screen this in '72, what was made in '72, Godfather Part 2. That doesn't go together, so they didn't show it in a regular cinema. But it got screened, yeah. it had screenings, and it did, this is the most important thing, it did, cinema at that time still did very, very strongly affect the reality it took inspiration from. And today you have to really work hard if you want to attain that. You know, put your film on YouTube, sell it around, like really work hard. The truth is that after he made his film, Jeleni couldn't get work in Yugoslavia anymore. So he escaped Yugoslavia. He wasn't banned, he wasn't really driven away, but you know, if he wanted to work, he had to abandon Yugoslavia. And one peculiar thing about him, one characteristic that he has, and that should be a characteristic of every good documentary filmmaker, is that he is acutely aware of what the most problematic things in a certain local environment always are. He's able to detect them, and he's always able to find the smartest way how to make a film about them, and then he does it. He makes a film about it. And he's also very smart enough to know that if you want to make a film which will be successful in the sense that it will communicate to the people everywhere, you simply have to be local. It's an old wisdom. You have to, you know, be local if you want to be universal. So he's always making films about these local subjects, like a very local subject, the subject of Novi Sad, but I think that this film could be played anywhere in the world, at any time, and people would get it. So he went to Germany in '72, and what was happening in Germany in '72, we probably all know. This was like the period where the Red Brigades were roaming around and Germany was on the brink of a revolution, and this was one thing which was happening. And the other thing which was happening was that the early 70s in Germany were the period of the really big wave of migration. At that time, there was this really big wave of migration from Italy, from Turkey, and from Yugoslavia. So Jeleni found himself in Germany. He detected these two problems, and he instantly started making films about these problems. And interestingly enough, it was him in Germany in the 70s, and not any other German filmmaker, and Germans had their own filmmakers at that time who were very good, like Fassbinder and so on. It was Jeleni who made the most interesting and radical films on these two subjects, on the subject of migration to Germany and the way Germany is treating migrants, and on the subject of Red Brigades. If anybody is interested, he has a website which is called simply zelimirzilnik.net. And it's a very generous website with like thousands of articles and long clips from his films. Yeah, .net. So in a sense, you know, since he started making films his first films are from mid-60s up until today, so it's over half a century. His films are some sort of a chronic of all the most problematic and relevant political happenings in his environment, which is the Balkans and Germany in the 70s, from where he had to return to Yugoslavia then, because he became a persona non grata in Germany because of these films he made with the Red Brigades and the immigrants. But then when he came back, he immediately realized that what's happening in the 80s is the Yugoslavia is breaking apart. So again, he was the first one who was making films about the breakup of Yugoslavia, about Albanians and about Kosovo. I mean, he was always there the first, and he always somehow he managed to always make a definite statement. So it's very hard for filmmakers to enter the same territory after he has already been there and make something, because you always, I mean, that's like a general rule in making films that you should know if you want to be filmmakers or producers. It's important to know what has been done in a certain area before you come to that area. Because I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks like that, it's really almost arrogant if you know, somebody would today say, I want to make a film about homeless people, and not carefully study how the issue of homeless people has been treated before in cinema, because you can only learn from that. And if you don't, you can only make a worse film because of that. And if you do learn from the past, then when you make a film, you are not only engaging with your subject, but you're also entering this creative conversation with the past and everything that happened, and making films all the more richer. Unfortunately, very, very few filmmakers are somehow aware of that. Especially in Slovenia, we have this acute problem of filmmakers who refuse to watch films because they think that if they watch films, this will then somehow distort their own vision which they have about films. Which is a very funny way of looking at things, because if your vision of how to make a film is so fragile that it can become distorted by only watching another film. Then for God's sake, don't make a film. You know, it's not good enough, this vision that you have. So it's important to know film history and to watch stuff from the past if you want to engage with cinema and films today. And this applies also to, I don't know, if you want to organize film festivals, it's always important to know what happened before you started doing whatever you're doing.